Hello Fate Makers, I'm Depriesticles, and for the past several days I've been on a mission to put together a thematic build using a Clawbringer, because when first looking at one of the action skills of this class, there's one very specific lightning and hammer wielding character who comes to mind. Thor is one of my favorite superheroes and a very iconic and interesting piece of Nordic history, and I think it would be a shame to not put something together to at least give a nod to what seems to me who this skill was quite clearly designed with in mind. So please allow me to show you the God of Thunder build. Upon first glance at these skill trees, some of you may be tempted to say, this is not a Clawbringer build, this is a Stabbomancer build. I've heard this said in my own chat, and I've seen people share this sentiment in other creators' chats speaking of their builds too. I think that's a pretty narrow mindset, and I would like to abolish this line of thinking. This spec, just like any other, is going to use skills from both trees, and it would not function the same as it does without those skill points where they are. Just because I only have 14 points into the Clawbringer does not detract from the fact that this build would not be the same without the Clawbringer in it, and I argue for those reasons that this is just as much a Clawbringer build as it is a Stabbomancer build. And let's start off by looking at where those 14 points are located. The first skill I'd like to talk about, called Oath of Thunder, is really the fulcrum of this build and primarily what the entire thing is focused around. Oath of Thunder reads, the Fate Maker's melee damage and his Wyvern companion deal bonus lightning damage. And with our first 5 points into it, we'll get a base bonus of 25% of our melee damage dealt. We'll get a few more points into the skill later on when we look at the equipment. We're going to care so much what the Wyvern is doing, but we do care quite a lot about the bonus lightning damage we'll get with our melee attacks. Because this build, in a nutshell, is to bring our melee damage up as high as possible, while also increasing our elemental and status effect damage to fully take advantage of the bonus damage we'll be getting while smiting our enemies. We'll then put 4 points into Oath of Fire for the times we can't reach our enemies with our melee attacks, and since we'll be increasing our elemental and status damage, these bullets will actually pack quite a punch, even though this is a melee-centric build. And the final 5 points for the Clawbringer will be in Dragon Aura, which will increase our elemental damage by 20%. It's a simple spec for this tree, but these points play an integral part for this build overall, and we'll see the synergies come together by looking at our skills from the Stabbomancer class. Our first 5 points here will be put into Arsenal, giving us a flat 15% damage increase to our spell, melee, and gun damage, and we're going to be using all 3 of these to get this build to function. Another 5 into Potent Poisons to give our status effects more damage and a longer duration, and 3 into Exploit Their Weakness, which further takes advantage of our status effects by debuffing our enemies, making them take an additional 6% damage by all sources for each status effect we apply. These last 2 skills have quite a lot of synergies in this build overall, and it's important to remember them as we move through the rest of the skill tree, and even into the equipment. 3 points into the follow-up skill, which grants us 60% increased melee damage on our next melee attack after dealing 10 ticks of gun damage, which is a massive boost considering that a large portion of that damage will be dealt again as bonus lightning damage. And we also have a way to cheat in some gun damage ticks. 1 point in the Shadow Step, giving us guaranteed critical melee hits as a kill skill, then max out the Sneak Attack skill, which will increase our critical damage by 15%. 1 point into Elusive for some survivability, and also we can shoot at our enemies at full speed while running directly at them to deliver more of a personal end to their existence. Another 5 points into 1,000 Cuts, which is another incredibly useful skill for us to grab since it'll grant us up to an additional 25% damage at max 25 stacks, and is accrued by getting critical hits and melee hits doubling up on the stack count, which is quite useful considering we are giving ourselves a 100% melee critical hit chance by putting 1 point into the Shadow Step skill. Our second to last point will be into Alchemical Agent, which will apply a random status effect with each melee critical hit, and each of those effects are going to give us a bonus damage dealt because of Exploit Their Weakness. And the final point will go into the capstone of the Stabbo tree, Executioner's Blade, for further bonus melee damage. The synergies between all of these skills is so incredible, and I'm really happy with the balance that I found between them all. But what makes this build exceptionally shocking will be found in the equipment, so let's take a look at what we can find there. It's now time to take a look at the featured item of this build, and I'm absolutely in love with it because it really ties this build together in an incredible way. And it is the Livewire. The Livewire is an exceptional SMG all by itself and will probably be used in quite a few of my builds I put together. However, there is one interaction that happens with this build that sets a whole new tone for our lightning theme. What is evident when using this weapon is that shooting it at an enemy will attach an elemental beam to nearby enemies to deal bonus lightning damage to all the baddies in the area. But what a friend and fellow content creator by the name of Moxsy had discovered through his testing of melee builds is that same elemental beam will attach itself to nearby foes while meleeing them while this gun is held in your hands. Thank you for finding and sharing this discovery with us. Moxsy's links will be in the description for those who don't already know him. The interesting thing about this beam is that it also counts as gun damage, and while you're punching all the goblins, crabs, and dogfish around the map, and the beams are creating a veritable spiderweb array of gun and elemental damage between them, each of the critical hits that are gained from those beams will proc our skills 1,000 Cuts, Executioner's Blades, and Follow-Up, increasing the damage we're dealing by tremendous amounts. Not only that, but because of our points into Oath of Fire, all that gun damage gets bonus fire damage stacked on top of it, and it applies yet another status effect to everything in the area, which then gets a bonus again off the potent poisons and exploit their weakness skills. It's because of this incredible synergy it brings to the table that the live wire is the featured item of this build. There will be times, however, where you simply will not be able to reach some of the enemies on the map, and you will be required to shoot at them. And the live wire is an okay source of damage in that circumstance, but the only other gun that is used with this build suits these situations in a much more satisfactory way. The liquid cooling delivers damage in numbers that are not easily scoffed at its base, but since it is a cryo weapon and will be firing fire-enhanced bullets out of it, it brings the gun game to this melee build to a whole nother level, and still synergizes with our multiple element sub-theme. The melee weapon of choice is this Fatebreaker. The Fatebreaker has a unique ability that reads, melee attacks create 3 lightning projectiles that restore ward equal to 100% of damage dealt. As a Thor build, this is very thematic with the lightning damage, but as a melee build, we're bound to take quite a lot of damage, and this particular weapon will help keep us alive, if not somewhat healthy. We get the added bonus of this being able to come in other elements, so with this in our hands, we get an additional cryo dot to the enemies we damage, which in turn nets us an additional 6% damage from our exploit their weakness skill. I managed to get very lucky with this early ring drop, which is a volatile full-spec melee ring. It grants 19.7 additional melee damage and roll with the passives of double melee crit chance as well as critical hit damage. The ring used in the other slot is this fingertip pulse oximeter with melee damage at its core and a couple of quite useful passives too. The shield I chose to use is this body rune for its life restoration and bonus fire damage properties. Not only is this keeping us alive with a passive kill skill, but it's also giving us bonus elemental damage and helping to melt our enemies. I also got quite lucky with my amulet drop, and this one works amazingly well with this build, but I do think this is the area that could be improved on the most. What I've been using is this purple rarity volatile amulet with lightning damage and Clawbringer power. The passives don't really do much to help us though, and I'd really like to roll a Theurge with lightning damage and Stabbo power instead of Clawbringer, but I have yet to find that very specific drop. The armor piece we're going to implement is this incredible Battlemaster's Calamity of Gnawing. I was very excited to get this to drop, and it is exactly what I needed to bring this build together for several reasons. It increases the power of both the Clawbringer and the Stabbomancer sides of this build, has bonus melee damage as a passive, increases our fire damage dealt for each unique enemy we hit, but most importantly, it has a whopping 4 points into our Oath of Thunder skill. With this equipped, we reach a maximum of 9 points into the skill, which nets us a total of 45% bonus damage as lightning damage based on our melee. With this, we are dealing almost 150% damage on each swing we take at the bad guys before any of our other bonuses are applied. This armor mod is absolutely massive for our lightning-wielding friend, and the build would not be the same without it. And finally, we see that the spell we're going to use is this Cloudburst Arc Torrent, and I picked this spell for multiple reasons. Firstly, it keeps with the theme of the build, and it's just fun and awesome to be able to rain lightning down on the bad guys in the surrounding area. And secondly, we're able to use this to activate our enchantment on it endlessly because of an interesting interaction. And speaking of enchantments, let's move towards that topic of discussion and see how effectively we're able to squeeze damage out of this build using them. The enchantment I have specifically on my spell reads, on spellcast, increase melee damage by 30% for 10 seconds. It's evident why you would want to use this enchantment, but what you may not know is that you don't actually have to cast the spell in order for this enchantment to proc. Since this is a channel cast spell and must be held in release to cast, all you have to do in order to proc this enchantment is briefly tap your spellcasting button. You may look a little bit silly as you're waving your wand out in front of yourself for a brief moment with no immediate damage effect happening, but your enchantment does activate. You will get a 30% damage increase to your melee hits for 10 seconds. You didn't use a spell charge, and it happens so quickly that it's easy to do while in the midst of fighting in order to make sure your damage bonus is being utilized 100% of the time. On the shield, we have an enchantment that reads, on action skill start, increase melee damage by 40% for 10 seconds, and on both of the guns we see, on action skill start, increase damage dealt by 20% for 20 seconds. Both of these are on action skill start effects, so we're going to want to make sure that we're using the action skill as often as possible, and I'll show you how and why that's effective in just a minute. The final enchantment is the one on our melee weapon, and it reads, gain 10% melee damage for a short duration after each consecutive melee attack. I did some testing on this, and I found that in order for this to proc, you do in fact have to make contact to an opponent with the weapon itself as opposed to the lightning bird projectiles. But it does not have to be the same target for you to gain the additional stacks. Meaning, if you kill one enemy with a single melee attack and then turn to swing at a different enemy, you will still get another stack added by this enchantment, granting you 20% bonus damage until the stacks start to decay. Since our primary damage is by swinging our sword, we'll get quite a healthy amount of stacks built up on this, and the damage we output is pretty incredible. There are only 2 variant items to this build that should be situationally switched out. Due to the mechanics and design of some bosses, it's just not feasible to rely on melee damage only in order to take some of them down. In the case of some boss fights, I have 2 other items that I keep in my backpack at all times to switch over to before entering the arena. And those are this Fatebreaker, which is exactly the same as the Fatebreaker we are already using, except it has the enchant on it that reads, gain 30% melee damage against bosses and badasses. This helps keep our damage boosted in these circumstances without having to rely on consistent melee hits. And the other variable would be the spell, which comes in the form of this volatile poison Buffmeister. This Buffmeister has the same enchant as the Arc Torrent spell we use, but the difference here is that we'll get an additional corrosive dot applied to the baddies upon dealing damage to them, which again pairs with Exploit Their Weakness and gives us a reliable way to deal high damage from afar. The downside to using this, though, is that we're unable to activate the enchantment on it as easily as we are with the Arc Torrent because of the multiple charges. However, our sword does have the Archmage ability on it, so if you can get close for some melee swings, then you'll be able to cast the Buffmeister a lot more often. Also, because of the Archmage, it makes it easier to switch to the Buffmeister as more of a full-time spell if you so choose. But this is Thor, and calling down lightning is cool, and fun, and lightning, because theme. Yeah. Regardless, both of these extra items will be included in the save file. One of the final points I'll very briefly touch on is our hero point allocation. This category is very simple, so without preamble, I will say that we're going to want to maximize our status damage and skill cooldowns as much as possible. It starts by choosing the Twist of Fate inventory hoarder at character creation, and then dumping all of our skills into wisdom and attunement until they are full, and then the final points I suggest putting into dexterity for better synergies with our critical hits. The only thing left at this point I haven't talked about is the action skill itself. The action skill in use is Storm Dragon's Judgment, and is the main reason I wanted to put this thematic build together in the first place. The Fate Maker hurls a hammer at his foes, dealing both lightning and melee damage on hit, and if left out where it's thrown, will deal lightning ability damage to anyone within its radius. With this build, though, we don't get many benefits for leaving it out on the field because we don't have very much spec into ability damage, but we do have quite a lot riding on our action skill start enchantments. This action skill comes with a side bonus of being able to recall it back to you and refunding a portion of the cooldown based on how long it's been active. This is one of the key elements for us because we're going to be able to spam our action skill every 6 to 7 seconds by throwing it and dealing insane amounts of lightning and melee damage, which then a portion of the melee damage again gets turned into yet more lightning damage. Just simply throw the hammer at a nearby enemy and immediately recall it back to you. The hammer's initial hit, as well as the travel back to you, will deal incredible amounts of damage, is very repeatable, and will also keep both of the action skill start enchantments we have active at all times. I think through my explanations it may have become apparent how to use this, but I will briefly explain the practical application when running the God of Thunder build. As you are approaching the mobs you plan on decimating, you should be shooting in order to start gaining stacks of follow-up and 1,000 cuts. Before reaching them, you can cast a short charge spell or just whiff it in order to proc the spell's enchantment, and then hurl your hammer at the furthest enemy. You target the furthest because as soon as it reaches that target, you'll want to recall it back to yourself, and it will deal more lightning damage to foes who trot along its path on its return trip back to you. At that point, you will have all your enchantments active, and you can start swinging away and watching everything in the area melt. Pay close attention to your action skill cooldown though, because as soon as it's available again, you'll want to recast it, keeping your 10-second enchantment alive. From that point, it's just a matter of casting spells and throwing Mjolnir every 10 or so seconds to keep all your buffs up, and you will run through the game, even at Chaos 20, as if it were a brisk walk through the park on a cool summer morning. The interactions that happen here keep me on my toes because of how intuitive it is, and this has easily become my favorite build in the game so far. Thanks for checking out the video, guys. If you want a copy of the save file that includes everything I've shown in today's video, make sure to join the Discord, read and agree to the rules, and navigate to the save file sharing section. Before you click away, though, don't forget to hit like if you liked, subscribe if you like me, and hit the little bell icon to be notified of future videos. You can also come say hi while I'm live over at twitch.tv/Depriesticles. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.